December 20th, 1972. Hanoi, North Vietnam. Captain Nguyen Van Than stood watch at his SA-2 missile site on the outskirts of the city, staring up at clouds so thick and low that visibility was measured in dozens of meters rather than kilometers. The monsoon weather had arrived with its characteristic intensity. Heavy rain fell continuously. Clouds extended from ground level to altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet, conditions that made flight operations nearly impossible and precise bombing completely impractical. Captain Nguyen and his crew could relax their vigilance. American tactical aircraft, the F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs that had struck targets throughout North Vietnam for years, required visual target acquisition. Pilots had to see their targets to attack them with any accuracy. In these conditions, visual bombing was impossible. Even if American aircraft somehow navigated through the weather to reach target areas, they couldn't identify specific targets through the clouds. They couldn't aim weapons without seeing what they were attacking. The SA-2 missile system Captain Nguyen operated faced similar limitations. The Guideline's fan-song radar tracked targets for missile guidance, but heavy precipitation degraded radar performance significantly. Rain returns cluttered the displays. Cloud moisture absorbed and scattered radar energy. The system could still function, but effectiveness was reduced substantially compared to clear weather operations. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries positioned throughout Hanoi were essentially useless. The gunners relied on optical sights to aim their weapons. Against targets obscured by clouds extending from ground to altitude, optical sighting was impossible. The guns remained manned, but everyone understood they would see nothing to shoot at until weather cleared. The pattern had been consistent throughout the war. During monsoon season, American air operations reduced dramatically. The North Vietnamese moved supplies, rebuilt damaged infrastructure, repaired transportation networks, and strengthened defenses, knowing that weather limited American offensive capability. The monsoon provided sanctuary. It always had. At 0340 hours, Captain Nguyen heard a sound that momentarily confused him. A deep, rumbling engine noise from above the clouds, the distinctive sound of jet engines, multiple engines, heavy aircraft. But no American tactical fighters operated in conditions like this. The sound was wrong for fighters anyway. Deeper, heavier, more engines than a fighter carried. Seconds later, Captain Nguyen heard explosions from the direction of central Hanoi. Not the impacts of surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft fire. The distinctive sound of large bombs detonating. Multiple explosions in rapid succession. The Hanoi radio transmitter facility, he realized. A strategic target that American planners had wanted to strike for months. The transmitter was being hit. In zero visibility. Through clouds so thick that ground observers couldn't see more than 50 meters. Minutes later, radio silence confirmed what the explosions had announced. The transmitter facility was offline. Direct hits had disabled it despite weather that should have made accurate bombing impossible. Captain Nguyen reported to his command center, describing what he had heard. The response from his superiors reflected confusion that would spread through North Vietnamese Air Defense Command over the following hours and days. Americans were striking targets through weather that should have protected them, striking with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without visual reference. The question that North Vietnamese air defense personnel asked repeatedly during December 1972 was simple. Americans strike targets we cannot see, in weather we cannot fly in. How is this possible? The answer was LORAN. And the capability it provided shocked North Vietnamese planners who had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that weather provided sanctuary from precise air attack. North Vietnamese air defense doctrine and capabilities had developed based on Soviet systems and Soviet training, optimized for clear weather operations against visual bombing. Understanding these limitations explains why LORAN-enabled all-weather precision striking created such operational and psychological impact. The integrated air defense network protecting Hanoi and other critical targets in North Vietnam included multiple layers of capability. SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missiles provided coverage against medium and high-altitude threats. Anti-aircraft artillery, ranging from small caliber guns to large 85mm and 100mm pieces, covered low altitudes and shorter ranges. MiG fighters provided mobile defensive capability, intercepting aircraft that penetrated the SAM and DAITOA coverage. The system was sophisticated by standards of the time, having been refined through years of combat experience against American air operations. But the system was designed fundamentally to counter visual bombing. The SA-2's Fansong radar provided target tracking that enabled missile guidance, but the system's effectiveness degraded significantly in heavy weather. Precipitation created false returns on radar displays. Cloud moisture absorbed radar energy. The tracking solutions the system developed in clear weather became unreliable when heavy rain or dense clouds interfered with radar propagation. SA-2 operators could still launch missiles during bad weather, but probability of intercept dropped substantially. Anti-aircraft artillery was even more weather-dependent. The optical sights gunners used to aim their weapons required visibility of the target. In conditions where clouds obscured aircraft from ground observation, AAA was essentially ineffective. Gunners could fire ballistically toward the sound of aircraft engines, but without visual tracking, accuracy was negligible. The thousands of ATITLA pieces positioned throughout North Vietnam became decorations during heavy weather rather than effective defensive systems. MiG interceptors faced similar constraints. North Vietnamese pilots required ground control intercept direction to find American aircraft. In heavy weather, the GCI radar's effectiveness degraded. Even if controllers could vector fighters toward targets, the MiG pilots couldn't engage effectively without visual acquisition of targets. The limited all-weather capability of MiG-21s didn't extend to bombing capabilities. The fighters could operate in clouds, but couldn't deliver ordnance accurately through weather. The historical pattern throughout the war reinforced North Vietnamese confidence in weather as sanctuary. American tactical air operations had consistently reduced during monsoon season. F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs conducting strike missions required visual target acquisition for accurate weapons delivery. Even with sophisticated radar systems, fighter bombers of the 1960s and early 1970s couldn't achieve precision strikes through complete cloud cover. They could drop ordnance without seeing targets, but accuracy suffered to the point where such attacks were ineffective against specific facilities. This weather-imposed operational tempo gave North Vietnamese forces breathing room during monsoon periods. They moved supplies south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with reduced interdiction risk. They rebuilt bridges and roads damaged during clear weather bombing campaigns. They repaired airfields and strengthened defenses. They knew American operations would intensify when weather improved, so they used weather protection to prepare for the next clear weather offensive. The confidence this pattern created was deeply embedded in North Vietnamese operational planning. When weather forecasts predicted heavy monsoon conditions, air defense commanders adjusted their posture. SAM sites could reduce manning slightly. AAA batteries could perform maintenance. MiG squadrons could stand down. Not completely. Vigilance remained. But the intensity that characterized clear weather operations could relax during monsoon periods. The weather would protect them. It always had. December 1972 shattered that assumption completely. The technology that enabled this paradigm shift was LORAN, a navigation system that had existed in various forms since World War II, but achieved its most devastating application in the skies over North Vietnam. LORAN, an acronym for long-range navigation, was a hyperbolic radio navigation system that enabled aircraft and ships to determine their position using time difference measurements of synchronized radio signals transmitted from multiple ground stations. The basic concept was elegant. A master station transmitted a radio pulse. Multiple slave stations, positioned at precisely surveyed locations, transmitted their own pulses synchronized to the master signal. An aircraft receiver detected these signals and measured the time difference between receipt of the master signal and each slave signal. Since radio waves propagated at known speed, the speed of light, time differences corresponded to specific distances from each station. The intersection of these distance measurements defined the aircraft's position. The LORAN C system, operating in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, consisted of multiple chains of transmitter stations positioned to provide coverage over North Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and surrounding areas. Master stations were positioned in Thailand. Slave stations were distributed geographically to create optimal coverage geometry. The chain configuration ensured that aircraft operating throughout the region could receive signals from multiple stations, enabling position determination. The accuracy LORAN C provided was revolutionary for long-range navigation. At ranges exceeding 1,000 miles from the transmitter stations, position accuracy was typically within 300 to 500 feet. For area targets like large facilities, rail yards, or storage complexes, this accuracy was sufficient to achieve successful strikes. While not precise enough for pinpoint attacks on very small targets, LORAN accuracy enabled engagement of strategic targets through weather that previously provided complete protection. Integration with B-52 bombing systems created all-weather precision capability. The B-52's navigator, positioned in the forward crew compartment with the pilot and co-pilot, operated the LORAN receiver and computed position solutions from the received signals. The LORAN position updated the aircraft's inertial navigation system, correcting drift that accumulated in inertial systems over time. The bomb nav computer used the updated position, combined with wind data, target coordinates, and aircraft altitude and speed, to calculate the precise point where ordnance should be released to impact the target. The autopilot flew the approach to the release point with precision human pilots couldn't match manually. At the computed release point, the bombs dropped automatically. The critical advantage was that this entire process occurred without any visual reference to the ground. The LORAN signals penetrated clouds, rain, fog, and any other weather phenomenon. Radio waves at LORAN frequencies were essentially unaffected by meteorological conditions that rendered visual and some radar systems ineffective. A B-52 could navigate precisely, determine its position continuously, calculate weapon release points, and deliver ordnance on target through complete cloud cover extending from ground level to altitudes above where the bomber operated. The development history of LORAN traced back to World War II, when the initial LORAN A system provided navigation support for Allied maritime operations. The technology evolved through the 1950s and 1960s, with LORAN C representing a substantial improvement over earlier versions. Higher frequencies, better receiver designs, and improved signal processing provided accuracy an order of magnitude better than original LORAN systems. By the early 1970s, LORAN C coverage extended globally through multiple chains, enabling long-range navigation for both military and civilian applications. Several advantages beyond all-weather capability made LORAN valuable for military operations. The system was passive from the aircraft's perspective. The B-52 only received signals, never transmitted anything. This meant North Vietnamese air defenses couldn't detect LORAN used the way they could detect active radar emissions. The navigation capability was independent of aircraft sensors, providing redundancy. If onboard radar failed or was jammed, LORAN continued functioning. If inertial navigation systems drifted beyond acceptable tolerances, LORAN provided correction. The redundancy increased mission success probability and aircraft survivability. Training for B-52 navigators emphasized LORAN operation as a critical skill. Navigators deploying to Southeast Asia received extensive training on LORAN procedures, signal identification, position plotting, and integration with other navigation systems. The navigator's ability to use LORAN effectively could determine mission success when operating in the weather conditions that characterized monsoon season. The system had limitations that crews understood and worked around. Skilled navigators were essential. The automation available in 1970 systems was limited compared to modern GPS-based navigation. Accuracy degraded at extreme ranges from transmitter stations, though even degraded accuracy remained sufficient for strategic targets. Signal interference or propagation anomalies occasionally created position errors that experienced navigators learned to identify and correct. But these limitations were manageable, and the capability LORAN provided far exceeded anything available before. The application of LORAN technology during Operation Linebacker 2 in December 1972 demonstrated its effectiveness in the most challenging operational environment: sustained bombing of heavily defended targets in North Vietnam during monsoon season. Operation Linebacker 2 commenced on December 18, 1972, with the objective of forcing North Vietnamese leadership to resume peace negotiations that had stalled during earlier talks. The operation called for sustained B-52 operations against strategic targets in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas, targets that had been largely off-limits during earlier phases of the air campaign. The timing, driven by political rather than meteorological considerations, meant operations would occur during monsoon season when weather conditions were typically unfavorable for precision bombing. The weather during Linebacker 2 operations was exactly what North Vietnamese air defense commanders had hoped for. Heavy clouds persisted throughout most of the 11-day campaign. Rain fell frequently. Visibility was severely limited. Under historical operational patterns, these conditions would have grounded most tactical air operations and forced postponement of strategic bombing until weather improved. But B-52s equipped with LORAN capability operated regardless of weather. The LORAN employment procedures B-52 navigators followed during Linebacker 2 were refined from years of experience with the system. As the aircraft approached North Vietnamese airspace, navigators would acquire LORAN signals from the Southeast Asia chain, verifying signal quality and confirming position accuracy. They continuously updated the inertial navigation system with LORAN position corrections, ensuring the aircraft's computed position remained accurate despite hours of flight time since takeoff. As the bomber approached the target area, the navigator would compute the weapon release point based on current position, target coordinates from the mission briefing, wind data from weather forecasts and onboard sensors, and the ballistic characteristics of the weapons being delivered. The release of ordnance occurred through automation that eliminated human variability. The autopilot flew the aircraft along the precisely calculated approach heading. At the exact computed moment, accounting for weapon ballistics and wind effects, the ordnance released automatically. The bombs fell through clouds the crew never saw through, toward targets they had never observed visually, guided only by the calculations that LORAN-based navigation enabled. The specific example from December 20th illustrated the capability. The Hanoi radio transmitter facility, a strategic target that North Vietnamese forces had expected to be sanctuary during monsoon weather, received direct hits in zero visibility conditions. The cessation of radio transmissions confirmed weapon impact before weather reconnaissance could verify damage visually. Ground observers reported that the accuracy achieved through clouds was comparable to what visual bombing produced in clear weather, an astonishing achievement that demonstrated LORAN's effectiveness. Rail yard attacks proved equally successful. The Yen Vien rail complex northeast of Hanoi, a major logistics hub for North Vietnamese military logistics, was struck repeatedly during Linebacker 2 despite weather that prevented visual bombing. LORAN-guided strikes achieved successful weapons placement that satellite imagery later confirmed. Craters appeared in the precise locations where track junctions, loading facilities, and rolling stock had been positioned. The strikes disrupted rail operations for weeks, achieving strategic effects despite weather conditions. Petroleum, oil, and lubricant storage facilities at Lang Dang received strikes through weather that completely obscured the target from visual observation. The secondary explosions and fires that resulted were visible through the clouds, confirming hits on fuel storage tanks. The destruction of pole stocks degraded North Vietnamese military mobility and logistics support, strategic effects that weather should have prevented until monsoon season ended. The North Vietnamese response revealed the psychological as well as operational impact of all-weather precision bombing. Initially, air defense commanders attempted to use weather as defensive cover, expecting operations to cease when monsoon conditions intensified. They repositioned SAM sites, moved supplies, and prepared for the operational pause they expected. When strikes continued regardless of weather, the realization spread through North Vietnamese forces that weather no longer provided sanctuary. The demoralization this created was substantial. Units that had relied on monsoon season for respite from air operations now faced continuous threat regardless of conditions. SAM effectiveness degraded significantly during Linebacker 2 due to weather limitations that LORAN didn't share. Radar tracking was difficult in heavy precipitation. SA-2 operators were forced to fire ballistic shots, essentially aiming at the sound of bomber engines rather than tracking targets precisely with radar guidance. Success rates dropped dramatically. Of the 15 B-52s lost during Linebacker 2, all to SAM engagements, none were lost specifically because weather aided the defenses. If anything, weather reduced defensive effectiveness more than it affected LORAN-equipped bombers. The sortie statistics from Linebacker 2 documented the scale of operations conducted through adverse weather. 729 B-52 sorties over 11 days delivered more than 15,000 tons of ordnance. A high percentage of these strikes occurred through clouds and weather conditions that would have prevented tactical aircraft operations entirely. The sustained tempo demonstrated that weather limitations that had constrained air operations throughout the war had been overcome through technology. Battle damage assessment after Linebacker 2 confirmed LORAN-guided strike accuracy. Post-strike reconnaissance, conducted when weather cleared sufficiently for photographic coverage, showed weapons impacts concentrated on intended targets. Rail yards had been cratered. Communications facilities had been disabled. Storage complexes had been hit. The accuracy achieved through clouds matched or exceeded what visual bombing produced in clear weather during earlier campaigns. The failure of North Vietnamese air defense doctrine to counter LORAN-enabled all-weather operations reflected technological gaps and doctrinal inflexibility that couldn't be overcome through tactical adaptation. The fundamental vulnerability was weather dependence embedded throughout North Vietnamese defensive strategy. The entire system assumed that weather provided sanctuary, that monsoon conditions limited American operations sufficiently to provide respite for defensive forces. LORAN negated this assumption completely. When weather no longer constrained attackers while still degrading defenders, the operational balance shifted decisively. The technology gap between American all-weather navigation capability and North Vietnamese lack of equivalent systems created asymmetry that tactical adjustments couldn't overcome. North Vietnamese forces had no navigation system approaching LORAN's accuracy and weather independence. Their operations remained dependent on visual reference, ground-based navigation aids, or radar systems that weather degraded. They couldn't replicate American all-weather capability with available technology. SA-2 limitations in weather were inherent to radar systems of that era. The Fansong radar's frequency and power characteristics made it vulnerable to precipitation interference. Soviet engineers had designed the system for clear weather operations, assuming that weather would constrain both attackers and defenders equally. When attackers gained all-weather capability that defenders lacked, the system's limitations became critical vulnerabilities. Doctrinal inflexibility prevented effective adaptation. North Vietnamese air defense doctrine, derived from Soviet training and experience, didn't include procedures for countering all-weather precision bombing. The tactics that worked against visual bombing, using weather as cover, repositioning during low visibility periods, concentrating forces when weather cleared, became ineffective when attackers operated independently of weather. No counter-tactics were developed during Linebacker 2 because no effective counters existed with available systems. Intelligence failure contributed to North Vietnamese surprise. While they certainly understood Americans had sophisticated navigation systems, they apparently didn't anticipate that LORAN would enable precision bombing through complete cloud cover. The preparation for Linebacker 2 operations did not include enhanced defensive measures for all-weather operations, because the threat wasn't fully appreciated until bombing commenced. The legacy of LORAN's employment during Linebacker 2 extended far beyond immediate operational results to shape air warfare doctrine and technology development for decades. The strategic impact proved that all-weather precision bombing was operationally feasible and tactically effective. Weather no longer provided sanctuary for strategic targets. Air campaigns could sustain operations regardless of meteorological conditions. This changed planning assumptions for both offensive and defensive operations. Attackers could schedule operations based on strategic and operational considerations, rather than waiting for weather windows. Defenders could no longer rely on weather to provide respite for recovery and resupply. The modern evolution of the concept established by LORAN led directly to GPS-guided weapons. While GPS technology fundamentally differs from LORAN in implementation, satellites replacing ground stations, more sophisticated signal processing, higher accuracy, the operational concept remains identical. Precision weapons delivery, independent of weather conditions, visual reference, or active aircraft sensors. GPS-guided munitions like JDAM bombs represent direct descendants of the LORAN-guided bombing concept proven during Linebacker 2. North Vietnamese post-war analysis acknowledged Linebacker 2's effectiveness, with weather operations identified as particularly demoralizing. Accounts from North Vietnamese military personnel describe the psychological impact of realizing weather no longer protected them. The assumption that monsoon season provided sanctuary had been fundamental to morale and operational planning. When that assumption proved false, the psychological effects amplified the physical destruction from bombing. Doctrine changes in military aviation worldwide reflected LORAN's demonstrated capability. Modern air forces assume all-weather operations as baseline capability, rather than specialized niche. Weather planning focuses on how conditions affect specific mission aspects, rather than whether operations are possible at all. The shift from weather-dependent to weather-independent operations represents one of Linebacker 2's enduring legacies. Technology proliferation of GPS-guided munitions has made all-weather precision standard by 2025. Joint direct attack munitions, laser-guided bombs with GPS backup, cruise missiles with inertial and GPS guidance. Virtually every modern precision weapon employs navigation systems immune to weather. The concept proven by LORAN during Linebacker 2 has become foundational to contemporary air warfare. December 20th, 1972. Captain Nguyen Van Tan stood at his SA-2 site, listening to explosions from central Hanoi, hearing American bombers above clouds so thick that visual operations should have been impossible. Realizing that the monsoon weather his forces had counted on for protection provided no sanctuary against precision strikes delivered through technology he didn't understand. North Vietnam had built its air defense strategy around the assumption that weather limited American operations. Monsoon season provided respite. Heavy clouds protected targets. Poor visibility grounded tactical aircraft and reduced strategic bombing effectiveness. These assumptions had been validated through years of operational experience. Weather had consistently constrained American air operations. Until it didn't. LORAN-equipped B-52s struck targets Captain Nguyen couldn't see in weather his forces couldn't operate in. Struck with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without visual reference. Continued operations day after day, regardless of meteorological conditions. The sanctuary monsoon weather had always provided vanished, eliminated by radio navigation technology that operated independently of clouds, rain, fog, or any other weather phenomenon. The 11 days of Linebacker 2 demonstrated decisively that technological advantage could overcome environmental constraints that had limited warfare throughout history. Weather had always affected military operations. Armies maneuvered in rain. Navies avoided storms. Air forces waited for clear weather. These limitations were accepted as immutable constraints that strategy and tactics had to accommodate. LORAN proved the limitations weren't immutable. Technology could overcome weather constraints. Precision operations could continue regardless of conditions. The sanctuary that weather provided to defenders could be eliminated through navigation systems that operated independently of environmental conditions. The North Vietnamese expected monsoon weather to protect their strategic targets, expected that heavy clouds would ground American aircraft or force inaccurate bombing that could be tolerated, expected that December 1972 would follow the patterns of previous monsoon seasons, providing weeks or months of reduced threat while they rebuilt, resupplied, and strengthened defenses. America struck through the monsoon as if it didn't exist, delivered ordnance with precision through clouds that prevented visual observation, maintained operational tempo that weather should have made impossible, demonstrated that technology had advanced to the point where environmental constraints that had limited warfare for millennia could be overcome through sophisticated navigation and weapons delivery systems. The concept proven during Linebacker 2, precision strikes independent of weather, delivered through technology rather than visual acquisition, remains fundamental to air warfare 5 decades later. GPS has replaced LORAN. Accuracy has improved by orders of magnitude. But the basic principle that North Vietnamese forces discovered to their dismay in December 1972 continues to define modern air operations. Weather no longer provides sanctuary. Technology has eliminated environmental constraints that once limited offensive operations. The all-weather precision capability demonstrated during Linebacker 2 evolved into the GPS-guided weapons that characterize contemporary warfare. And it all began with radio navigation signals penetrating clouds over Hanoi, enabling B-52 navigators to calculate release points for weapons that struck targets no one could see. Through weather everyone thought would protect them.